Good morning, everyone. My name is Hannah from HR Toolkit, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar. For those who are new to us, HR Toolkit provides HR software for SMEs, and we run an ongoing programme of webinars covering a variety of HR and business topics. Today, we are looking at managing long-term absence, posing the question, how would you manage an employee with long COVID? Our fantastic guest speaker will be covering the impact of the pandemic and long COVID on how organisations can manage absence, how to support employees who are absent long term and help reintroduce them to the workforce, and the legal issues to consider in relation to long-term absence and disability discrimination. Following the presentation, which will last around 30 minutes, we will have time to answer any questions in the Q&A section of the webinar. So the Q&A box, if you wiggle your mouse, is just at the bottom of your Zoom panel. So if you do have any questions as we go along, please put your questions in the Q&A box instead of the chat, as we might not find them in the chat. But do get involved in the chat if you do have anything to contribute. It's a great place to start. And today's session, just a note, is just offering general advice, not legal advice. And today as well, we are introducing a special offer exclusively for webinar attendees. So if you do sign up to HR Toolkit, you can get 3 months free of charge. We have many useful features for HR management, including absence management. So this is well worth checking out. To get the 3 months free, complete a form on our website using the promo code free as it is said on the slide there, if you missed that. And we will put a link in the chat now if this is something that your business or your HR team are wanting to consider. So to introduce Toby today, Toby is a Senior Associate at Freeths LLP Employment Law Department, who has a particular focus on managing employees and employment issues, including defending employment tribunal claims. He provides focused and relevant employment law training, seminars for businesses, employers and HR professionals. So Toby, if you may, take it away, and if you want to put your slides up just in case you've got any issues with those.
Thank you very much, Hannah. It's almost as if I wrote that introduction, so thank you very much for that. Right, I'm just going to try and share my screen. Give me one moment. Right. Okie dokie.
Lovely stuff. I can see your screen now.
Excellent.
Fantastic.
Amazing. Well, thank you again, Hannah, for that introduction. So yes, my name is Toby Pochron. I'm an employment law solicitor from Freeths LLP. My area of expertise is employment law. Generally, I advise businesses on how to go about generalised employee management, how to deal with employment tribunal claims, and a lot of aspects in relation to discrimination as well. So as you can probably imagine, over the last sort of 18 months or so, we've seen a real development in this particular area of law. Long COVID and absence management itself and how those two things interact have become a real hot topic for businesses. I'm sure a lot of you on the call already are HR officers, HR directors, HR consultants, and owner-managed businesses. And it doesn't go without any way of saying that absence management in itself is inherently complicated. Absence management is probably one of the most tricky areas to deal with, not only because of the legal aspects to it, and you can kind of really park those points. It's really the practical application of those management processes and how you go through those with each individual person. It's always tricky because every individual person has got different requirements, different needs, a different character. And so whilst we have a set process in place, I love policy and procedure, said this before, I love it, it's a big warm blanket, everyone knows exactly what's going to take place, but you do have to adapt those depending on who you're dealing with. This particular webinar itself is going to be looking at long-term absence management, specifically in relation to long COVID. So I'm going to be looking at sort of the impact of the pandemic and long COVID itself and how organisations are going to manage absence, how you can support employees, how you can manage that absence effectively, really looking towards reintroducing them into the workforce, And then finally, I'm going to consider some points in relation to disability discrimination and how long COVID can potentially factor into that. I've got written down my notes here, ask for next slide, but I'm controlling my own slides today. So next slide, please. Seamless, lovely. So I'm going to start off with an examination a bit more about what long COVID actually is. So very briefly, and I'll explain why very briefly. Very briefly, long COVID is an informal term that's been used to commonly describe two ways in which COVID can continue after the initial infection. So you've got signs and symptoms that continue to develop or just continue on for 4 weeks after the initial COVID. That's split in between symptomatic COVID, that's if it's under 12 weeks, or post-COVID symptoms for over 12 weeks. So it's sort of split between these two sort of continuing areas, whether or not you show any signs of illness initially when you have COVID, but develop signs and symptoms later on, potentially after the main infection is completed, or whether or not your symptoms just simply continue throughout that period of time. So, I mean, the term long COVID is being used commonly. It's COVID that extends over a significant period. Now, the symptoms from the NHS website were described, and there are loads. So, tiredness and fatigue, shortness of breath, chest pains and other tightness, problems with memory, what's being commonly described as a brain fog, difficulty sleeping, difficulty concentrating, dizziness, joint pains, pins and needles, depression and anxiety, tinnitus, earaches, loss of sense of smell or taste, rashes. A study that was produced earlier this year in July showed that there are actually 203 symptoms of long COVID that they've currently identified. That was following surveying just shy of 4,000 people who had long COVID or suspected long COVID in 56 countries. Now, the real issue with that is that level of symptoms that arise from a single illness can be inherently tricky to spot. It could be someone who's just saying, I've got difficulty concentrating, I'm continually tired. Those points can be potentially linked back to long COVID. And I'll go on a bit later in the presentation about why that's going to be a tricky issue for businesses to manage. But I think initially, to start off with, it's not just simply the case that it's one or two things that arise out of long COVID. It is a gigantic amount of different symptoms that can all be tracked back. Now, the impact this might have on the workforce, and I'm going to say it's going to be likely that in the workforces that you guys operate in, there is going to be somebody who's going to develop long COVID. I mean, some of the Office for National Statistics reports that have been produced recently show that 2% of private households have someone living in them who has long COVID or is showing signs of long COVID that can't easily be attributed to another illness. That's steadily risen. So it was 1.9%. So it's about 1.2 million people. And that was in November, the study that was produced in November. And back in September of this year, it was 1.1 million, so 1.7% of the population. So it's showing that gradually, as time is going on, the amount of people with long COVID is steadily increasing. Obviously, those numbers there, potentially 2% of the population having some similar illnesses or experiencing those symptoms, that is quite significant. So it's probably going to bleed across into your businesses at some point if it hasn't done so already. The most common symptoms, and these are the real ones that we tend to see cropping up quite regularly, are fatigue. Apparently half of people, 55% of people with self-reporting long COVID have experienced a level of fatigue. Shortness of breath, that's 39%. Loss of smell is a real common one for people who've got COVID already, that's 33%. And then difficulty concentrating, that's 30% as well. So just to cover off those again: fatigue, shortness of breath, loss of smell, and difficulty concentrating. So those are the most common symptoms that arise out of it. And those are ones you're going to be seeing are going to have an effect on people when they do start coming back to work after the initial illness. Now, this particular illness itself is inherently new. So we don't really quite know what the impact of that is going to be on the workplace just yet. So trying to look at guidance about how businesses can approach these levels of absences, it's comes from a lot of different sources. I'm sure a lot of you know about the guidance that's produced by ACAS. So ACAS itself is a government body that mediates all employment law disputes, and they do put out regular guidance on how to manage absences, and they can give you assistance in how to manage employees. Now, what ACAS have said on its face is that you can treat long COVID related absences in the same way that you would treat other absences. So, if you've got a formal procedure that you're going to use for any type of absence, you can simply apply that to long COVID and run that type of absence and absence management process in the same way. Now my view is that that's not the correct approach to take. Now I know that going against the ACAS guidance can be tricky, but in my view is that because of this aspect of what I'm going to call newness, so it's a new illness, we don't quite know the impact of it, we don't quite know how it's going to be carried out, we don't quite know what the symptoms are for it, we don't quite know who develops it or why they develop it either. So this principle of newness means it is not yet understood. So you can, and you've got your absence management policies in place, they apply to every type of absence that comes into a business. Now you can just simply rely on those and say, well, we treat everybody exactly the same, this is how it's all going to operate out. But this aspect of it and trying to balance the absence management process with understanding, when that person's going to return to work, what impact these symptoms are having on them, and when those symptoms are likely to resolve, is going to be really tricky. Because if you can get a doctor to give you a report about someone's long COVID, it's likely going to be considering points like, we just don't have enough information. We don't know how long these symptoms are going to last. Really, we don't know or have any data to work on to say what makes those symptoms better. And that's normally the process for someone who's been on long-term sick, is that an employer has to have an accurate medical picture about that person's state of health and when they're likely to return. So normally that lasts for, can last for 26 weeks. And at that point, seek a medical report, occupational health provider, that gives you that information, allows you as a business to take your own decisions on that. Now, in this respect, getting those types of medical reports, either a doctor might refuse to provide them, an occupational health specialist may not simply have the information there to be able to do a proper assessment, and that can leave you in this kind of gulf of information. So for me, saying that it's simply the same as every other illness or can be treated the same doesn't quite show that newness to it. It doesn't quite show the inherent complexity that comes along with this type of illness. Now my view is that there can be an adaptation, there should be an adaptation to absence management processes to account specifically for long COVID and long COVID related symptoms. Now, my view on it is that we should be using what I would refer to really as an employee-led process. So normally you have employer-led, doctor-led. So we want to know that information from them. So my view in terms of long COVID is to say to an employee, well, you're experiencing these types of symptoms, have you sought medical advice? What can we do here? What steps can we take in order to support you? And it's likely that that individual will be able to give us a bit of a better impression about what they're suffering at each time, when they suffer those symptoms. Is there something that makes them reoccur? Are they worse in the morning, worse in the afternoon? That type of thing. And getting that initial information first, it's not something you'd normally do, especially in long-term absence, because you want to get that medical report before you go and speak to the employee, before you consult with them. So my view in this scenario is to make it more employee-led. Start the process as early as you possibly can. So if someone develops COVID, it doesn't resolve within the initial sort of 10-day waiting period, or within the next 4 weeks, they start developing signs of fatigue and brain fog and shortness of breath. Start managing that process now. At that point when that's indicated, say to that person, well, look, we clearly to us, we think that there's some ongoing symptoms for you. We want to manage that with you. And it just starts that process off really, really early. Because they make it employee led, start it as early as you possibly can. And then I would put more stages into it as well. So, normally it's first, final, and then an outcome that's produced for someone who's got ill health, especially if we know that that isn't going to resolve very quickly, we can take that decision as an employer. But I would say here is that we want to be having more informal conversations first, more seeking of medical evidence as early as possible. And then at that stage, adding in more more potential barriers to get over, to make sure that we're not just doing this too quickly or having someone removed from their employment on an unwarranted basis. It's those aspects of it that can cause us issues, especially with unfair dismissal and then discrimination, as I'm going to come on to in a minute. So yes, you can treat it the same way as any other illness. You can just rely on your policies as well. But I think because of this element of newness, because of the fact that we don't have proper information about it, because of the fact that doctors won't have proper or detailed information about it and might not be willing to put their name to those reports, that at that point, I think you need to adapt the process to be more employee-led and a bit longer. So that's my view initially. Now, you can then look at, once you've got someone on long-term sickness, obviously the main aim is to get that person back to work. You know, if that person is able to return, we want them to return so that we're not suffering the loss of that employee. We're not suffering having to go through a full process with them. If they can return and do work for us, that's obviously beneficial for everybody. But having people come back into the workplace, it's, you know, after long-term absence, it is always tricky in trying to reintegrate people. But long COVID itself carries this level of intricacy to it. And the reason for that is that there can be a gulf of information initially. So the first point I make there is in relation to educating your employees about long COVID and the potential symptoms for it. I think a lot of employees will have heard about long COVID. It's been in the news, and they might know about the key symptoms to it as well. But as a business, what we want to be doing is controlling the flow of information. So we want to make sure that if we've got a long COVID policy, if we've got a policy about absence management, that we're building that in now. And we're saying to people, well, look, if you've got long COVID, symptoms of long COVID, here's how you make that report internally. You know, here's the person who's going to be dealing with this for you. You're making sure that management and HR teams know the signs and the symptoms and can go some way towards spotting those as well. I think things like fatigue, you know, that's tricky because it might just be someone who constantly is late for work. It might just be someone who is developing tiredness while they're in, someone who's not able to concentrate in work. Those aspects of it are inherently not avert. You know, they're things that can go unnoticed for a significant period of time. So it's worthwhile training your HR staff to say, well, look, if someone's developing these signs, then what are we going to do? Because we think that might be long COVID if they reported to us that they had COVID earlier. You know, and then we can just address that with them as well. We can adapt our policies to build in that education towards this new illness that we don't know too much about. So, you know, changing our mental health policy, changing our remote working policy, looking at our health and safety policies as well, about whether or not it's safe for that person to work in certain parts of the office, whether or not we need to make any adjustments for them, and then looking really predominantly at our sick pay and our absence management policies as well, and building in requirements for that for education and training too. Now, occupational health assessments, I've just gone about sort of bashing them and saying that obviously at this point in this development of this new illness, that having an occupational health assessment might not be worthwhile initially. Obviously, occupational health assessments do carry some level of weight to them, especially in this scenario. You know, if they can give us something, the individual told us this, they helped us to develop how we're going to be looking at, you know, that person in their workplace, what they told that occupational health provider, that they might not be willing to share with us as their employer as well. They might feel a bit more secure in sharing that with an occupational health provider instead. And having that report, you know, it will be beneficial, but it's with that caution that really we don't quite know what that report's going to come back with, and it might not be helpful for anyone, us or the employee. But then we look at different ways that we can adapt our workplace, you know, to assist people who've got long COVID, you know, considering sort of flexible workings, you know, speaking with the employee, really consulting with them about what they need, and then considering all aspects for reasonable adjustments as well. So reasonable adjustments are a requirement if someone is disabled. It's to assist or remove in any barriers that person might have to be able to work. So, you know, physical changes to the workplace, simply be putting someone on a lower floor so they don't have to climb the stairs if they're going to get out of breath. Changes to the way in which they work, amending their workload, amending their start and end times, you know, managing their tasks so they're not going to get too bogged down with things. If they're suffering from a bit of brain fog, you know, what does that entail? Does it mean that we can't give them a whole raft of tasks to do? Is it better to give them a single task, let them perform it, and then report back to us that that's then being completed, rather than saying to them, here's all these, and they can't then get through that and look to complete all those tasks without just simply getting too bogged down and, you know, losing their concentration on it as well. Obviously, those are going to be specific to each individual, so we need to know what their points are and what they're suffering before we can make that adjustment for them. But another factor to be particularly wary of is what's called, it's called COVID fatigue. COVID fatigue, and what that means is that the managers and HR staff who are dealing with someone who's got long COVID simply get weary of dealing with them. So, you know, as time goes on, as a long-term illness develops, especially if there isn't that education about the fact that long COVID might be for an indefinite period, the fact that long COVID might not resolve, you know, the fact that long COVID in itself might have varying symptoms that manifest differently on different days. And what you can end up with is people are going through management, getting to the point where they become a bit less supportive, you know, they become a bit less tolerant to how that person is coming into work. They get a bit weary with it, they get fatigued in dealing with that individual. And that can be an inherent problem in itself, because the process used can be absolutely spot on. Excuse me, the process used can be absolutely spot on, but that individual who's then dealing with their employee just gets weary of dealing with them. And that can lead to either the employee feeling disenchanted, it can lead to them feeling isolated, lead to the process not being followed. And it's that level of it that needs that education to make sure that there are those constant checks. So we've got a duty of care as an employer to the individual. You know, we've got a duty of care towards our managers as well, to make sure that they're properly trained to be able to deal with these things. If we start seeing signs that the manager itself is just getting frustrated, they're getting to a point where they're not really dealing with that employee, and they don't want to deal with them at all because they feel that it's non-value added, or they're dealing with them in a very harsh process, they're not then seeking advice from HR, it might be worth looking at a way to mediate that, provide that person with training, or take that process off them and deal with it more centrally instead. So, you know, you're trying to build these points in to make sure that there is that effective absence management process. It's going to be worthwhile. Mental health and communication. I mean, these are some obvious common issues that we do see regularly, certainly with COVID, you know, certainly in the last sort of 18 months as well, is that people have been suffering quite significantly with their mental health. Feelings of isolation, depression, and anxiety have all steadily increased. Where someone was expecting to get better after COVID and they haven't then got better, they can continue to feel isolated throughout that point in time. So, you know, having check-in meetings with that person, even if they're on long-term sickness, can go some ways to avoiding that. Working out with them at the very start when they are sick or suffering initially, what they need from you. Do they need to be left alone? Are the type of person who will not thank you if you call them every week? You know, are the type of person who just wants a single letter every couple of months to say, hope you're doing okay, here's your confirmation of your ongoing rights to sick pay, that will end on X date, we will contact you again on Y date. You know, giving them that structure for it. Or are they someone who wants to be kept up to date, constantly receiving emails about things that are going on within the business? They want checkup calls with them every week. And then we balance that between what we can actually achieve. You know, a call every week might be too onerous for the business, but equally we might want to do that, to be in touch with them about it. It's just about agreeing that, but agreeing at the very start, setting it out so that everyone knows which way it's going, and making sure that that's an adhered to. That can really help that communication, and it just helps that individual to know what the next step is. That can go some ways to reducing anxiety about how long they've been off for, and equally what it's going to be like for them when they do return. It can be some people just get themselves into an anxiety state, whether they're not able to return because they're so worried about not being able to return that they then can't return. And that in itself can be managed through proper communication, making sure that individual knows sort of what's going to happen when they do come back. You know, examples of organisations who've done some really unique things about mental health, Aviva. You know, they've offered free access to these meditation apps, Headspace and Thrive. You know, they've started running wellbeing campaigns, the thing they've called #BackToBest. You know, and that's where staff can actually earn points that they can use towards other benefits if they do something that's likely to boost their wellbeing. So if they meditate or they exercise or doing something like that, or they get involved in a program that's offered through work like yoga, then that can actually give them the benefits that they then achieve. So they can see not only the well-being boost, but also an actual benefit to themselves as well. And they found really good uptake with that. You know, again, ongoing flexible working across the board, you know, that's not a bad thing. It's kind of come out of the pandemic because a lot more businesses are willing to consider either full or hybrid flexible working as well. A bank in the East Midlands, they've had things called walking one-to-ones. So where you've got a locally based employee, the manager will go and meet up with their employee at that point, and they go for a walk around together, have their one-to-one whilst they're walking. It develops that sort of well-being. Freeths have done a winter well-being day, so we're all getting a day off. The offices are closed, so no one can work on it, and it's to focus on well-being and family. You know, having those sort of put out to people and saying, look, we've got this on the agenda, we're talking about this, we want to make sure that you're involved in it, just goes some ways to give them that open channel to know, actually, they are going to support me when they come back. I'm not just going to be criticised for being off for an illness I don't really know how long it's going to last for. They want to help my well-being. That's just going to help people to return to work, and it can just reduce that layer of anxiety. So the very final slide for me today is just in relation to how this long-term absence is going to impact on the potential for discrimination. So as a starting point, the Equality Act is what sets out the laws surrounding discrimination. So it protects all employees, workers, and any job applicant from direct or indirect discrimination, harassment or victimization, and that's on the grounds of any protected characteristic. Now, that in itself carries tons of legal precedent about what those clauses mean. But I'm going to particularly focus on disability today. I think that does interact quite well with long COVID. So what I've got on the screen here is the legal definition. This is from the Equality Act, about how disability is determined by an employment tribunal. So the legal definition of disability is inherently different from the medical definition. So the medical definition is decided by a doctor. It describes what that person might be, and then that can be assessed by a government agency on the basis of what a doctor says. The legal definition of disability is assessed by a judge in an employment tribunal about whether or not what that individual is going through falls within the definition as set out within the Equality Act. So I'm just going to break this down in turn and just look at how this can impact on long COVID, just to make sure that I'm driving these points home, because it is a tricky test. And there's a lot of words on the screen there. They all carry their own individual meanings. So the first requirement is whether or not there is an impairment. So an impairment just means something that someone can't do. They're stopped from doing it. And the focus of this actually aspect of law is not on what that person is able to do, it's what they're impaired from doing, what they're stopped from doing. Now, for the purposes of the legal definition of disability, there is no need at all for a formal medical diagnosis to exist for an impairment to be established. An impairment is just simply what that individual is impaired from doing. You don't need a doctor to say that individual is impaired from taking this step. That individual themselves can determine whether or not they are prevented from doing something. But it's not, it's not strictly necessary to determine the precise nature of an impairment either. Provided it exists, and provided it can be adduced that it has an effect on that individual, that will be enough to determine that an impairment is actually in place. So it's what's called a functional approach. So we look at what that person is saying they cannot do. You don't have to identify an underlying cause. We don't have to identify, at what point we think this might have an impact on them, or whether or not we think what they're saying is correct, or how long it's going to last for. We simply look at, well, look, are they saying that they suffer that? Is that an impairment? Does it prevent them from taking a step? And if those tests are met, then at that point, that first part of the text is ticked off. Then you look at whether or not the impairment itself has a substantial and long-term adverse effect on the ability for that individual to carry out their normal day-to-day activities. So I've highlighted and underlined here the points that require their own set of definitions. So substantial in this scenario, so substantial part of whether or not an impairment has an effect, it simply means in this scenario whether it has a more than minor or trivial impact. So substantial in normal language would be something that's really significant, something that has a big effect on someone. But in discrimination legislation, substantial simply means more than minor or trivial. So it's anything that affects that person more than a minor or trivial degree. And it's that aspect that can interact with long COVID, because the impact of the severity of the condition isn't really kind of taken into account because it's such a low bar to meet. So an individual who has some level of fatigue or some level of shortness of breath, and that prevents them from doing a walk that they would normally do. It prevents them from leaving the house. It prevents them from walking past a corner shop because they feel as if they're going to get too tired to do that. That's a substantial impairment. Anyone who said that actually now I can't stand up too quickly from a chair because if I do, I get really short of breath. That might only last for a couple of minutes, but once that's abated, I'm then fine. That's an impairment. This piece of legislation and the guidance that comes from the European Court of Human Rights is quite clear in that it is determined to try to find disability for individuals. The focus should be on determining that someone achieves protection rather than from them being removed from protection. So if it has a more than minor trivial effect on somebody, then it can be tick that box and it can be part of the test for disability. But where long COVID might fall down in terms of the disability legislation is whether or not the effects are long term. So long term in this scenario means more than 12 months. So has it already lasted for 12 months, or is it likely to last for at least 12 months? Likely in that scenario just means it could well happen. And it's this aspect of it. It's going to be difficult to assess whether or not long COVID would fall into the definition of disability or not. So, you might have someone who's already had long COVID for over a 12-month period. If they exhibited those symptoms, they've lasted for 12 months, they have an impairment, then it's more than substantial, and it stops them from doing their normal day-to-day activities, like what I described, standing up out of a chair, walking to the corner shop, those aspects to it, that's going to be a disability. Now, someone who's just developed long COVID, they would only be protected under disability legislation if that is likely to last for longer than a 12-month period, or it's likely to reoccur. Now, that is going to be tricky because I don't know whether or not a doctor would be able to put their name to that and say, well, yeah, we think it is likely this is going to reoccur. More likely than not, what they'd simply be saying is we've got some data here that says that this may reoccur, but simply put, we don't know how it affects each individual. So it'd be better for businesses to treat long COVID as if it might be a disability and therefore might achieve the protections that come from that. So it comes from making reasonable adjustments, ensuring that absences are treated appropriately and you're not discriminated on the grounds of having long COVID. It's that aspect of it that does cause some concern and does put up a potential risk. So the TUC, the Trade Union Conference, have recently asked for long COVID to be recognised formally as a disability, and that's not yet been taken on. Frankly, in my view, to say it's likely that it's going to be considered to be a disability, but the only real time it's going to fall down is on this long-term adverse effect. So whether or not that's going to last for more than 12 months or is likely to reoccur in a 12-month period. So it could be at the end of a 6-month period, completely abates, and that person is no longer disabled at that point. And thereby, all the absences they've had are treated just as normal absence. We manage them through our normal process rather than looking to treat it with a bit more care in terms of disability-related absence. So it's that balance to it, and we don't quite know what it's going to be like. So taking that more cautious approach to it, making it employee-led, adding more stages into it, looking at reasonable adjustments, flexible working, it can only be beneficial because we're not quite sure how long this is going to last for, and there's that potential risk that arises from it as well. Also with this, and I know I haven't covered off the other protected characteristics, but within the reports that we've been reading about long COVID, it also has been found to impact more on older people, ethnic minorities, and women. So there can also be a potential that those categories of individual are also protected under different allegations for within the Equality Act. So not only are they protected by potential disability, they're also going to be affected by potential indirect discrimination on the grounds of their age, on the grounds of their racial ethnic origin, and on the grounds of their gender as well. So not only does it impact within the disability, it can also impact on those other areas too. So it's worthwhile now on setting out, well, what can we do? So we can change our absence management processes. We're going to educate our HR and our managers about the impact that has. We're going to make sure we've got that documented down too. Then we look at maybe our recruitment processes as well. So if you're having someone who's being recruited, they say, oh, I've got long COVID, I've potentially got all these absences, just to let you know, I've got fatigue as well as that runs along, I've got these symptoms currently. If you're made aware of that, then you're required to make reasonable adjustments for that job seeker. And if you don't take that step or you refuse that application simply on the basis they do have long COVID, then you're potentially falling foul of discrimination legislation as well. So having a documented recruitment process about how you're going to manage that, putting reasonable adjustments in place as you would do for other disabilities as well, that can only be a good thing. And it's morally good. It's good for employers to conform with the moral aspects of making sure that disabled people can come into work and they don't have barriers to achieving that. But equally, then there is that element of reducing the overall risk that comes with litigation and the obvious kind of reputational damage that comes from that as well, if you are pursued to an employment tribunal. So not the lightest end for this, but hopefully what I've done is give you some kind of practical tips about what to look at right now and some steps to kind of take towards achieving that too. And hopefully just giving you a bit of an overview about the potential issues that arise from this, so you can go away and start putting that into a practice in your business. So I know we do have some time for Q&A as well. If you would like a copy of these slides with the notes that I've just been talking about as well, please just drop me an email and I'm more than happy to send those over to you. I think the notes I've written down are going to substantially differ from what I've said, as I tend to just bang on about the points I want rather than from reading from them directly. But please let me know. I'm more than happy to send them on. So I think we're moving to Q&A. I don't know if there are any questions that have popped up, but I'm more than happy to answer anything that anyone has.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Toby. That was really insightful. We've had a few questions already come through, so that's great. If you do have any questions on the top of brain, please do put them in the Q&A box, please. Just before we're moving on to the Q&A session, we're just going to run a quick poll. So this poll, if it should pop up on your screen now, just wait for it to come through. Oh, brilliant. And this is just simply just to get insight on absence management within your business. So if you would mind answering the poll, the question is, what's your organization's biggest challenge when it comes to managing absence? The options here, we've got recording absence information consistently, making calculations, for example, sick pay, Bradford factor, assuring absence procedures are followed, and reporting on absence. So it'd be really insightful to know from your businesses what is difficult about managing absence effectively. Brilliant. Just give you another couple of seconds to go through that. Oh, fantastic. Got a lot of response. Fantastic. Thank you very much. And we shall go on to the questions here. Sorry, 1 second, my laptop's just glitched. So the first one we've got from Nicola, Toby, and it said, would legislation need to be changed for long COVID to be handled in the workplace, like cancer is COVID under EQA? Could be best practice, but I wonder if there will be legal change.
Yeah, it's probably unlikely that they will formally change the law to include it. So cancer itself is a deemed disability under the Equality Act. So the test I just described there about disability doesn't apply to a number of illnesses, cancer being one of them. If you've got cancer, then you are deemed disabled until you automatically receive protection. I can't see them doing that for long COVID, mainly because it's so varied in terms of the symptoms. We don't know about it just yet. And also, I think it's adequately covered by the Equality Act already. It's just about whether or not that's going to last for that longer than 12-month period. I think it is protected. I think it's unlikely that we'll see anything further on it, or anything more formal.
Brilliant. Thank you. I hope that answers your question. We have another question from an attendee saying that you mentioned not doing the process too quickly for managing long COVID. What would you define as too quick? Yeah,
so I think with speed of processes, it can be if someone's on long-term sickness absence that they simply aren't going to return to work. So the way in which you would manage that normally is to write to them, get an accurate medical report, and then consult with that individual and decide whether or not they're going to be able to return within the time frame that you require them to. So normally that's after the end of 26 weeks, after the end of the SSP period, and then you look to decide whether or not they're going to come back in a further time. Can we wait a further 3 months? Can we wait a further 6 months? And then balance that. In terms of long COVID, don't know how long it's going to last for. So what I wouldn't want to see businesses doing was jumping at it too quick. So someone says, I'm suffering with long COVID. I've got now fatigue and I can't get out of bed. I'm not quite sure how long this is going to last for. What I wouldn't want to see is a business go in too quickly with that and start doing that long-term absence management process at the very start. I think it's about sort of developing that employee-led approach, making sure that we do extend that out. Unfortunately, you can never give an accurate timescale about what's too long and what's too short. That kind of thing just keeps me in a job. mainly because I have no idea what our judges say when we get to a tribunal. You know, they might say you should have waited. They might say, I can't believe you waited this long, well done. You know, it's all about that balance that comes on with it. But I think taking the approach of trying to support, trying to get reasonable adjustments, get as much information as possible before we make those decisions, or just take those decisions over a longer period, you know, talking months rather than weeks.
Brilliant, thank you. We've got a lot of questions coming through. So if you do have any, please do put them in the Q&A box. I can see the chats going, so please do put them in the Q&A box. I can see them. A question here from Jenna. At the moment, GPs and medical consultants have an obligation to respond to medical requests within a certain timescale or have to meet a certain standard. Employers are facing increased timescales waiting on medical professionals to respond, and some never do. What advice would you give to employers waiting on medical advice?
Yeah, I mean, that is a real common problem. So GPs, as far as I can tell, don't have an obligation to respond to requests from employers. They are required to act in the best interest of their patient. So whilst we can say we want this and that the employee or the patient themselves has consented to it, the GP themselves doesn't have a requirement to do that, other than the requirement to sign a Med 3 form. So the way in which I've managed that normally would be to develop a relationship with an occupational health provider. You know, it's tricky really, because GPs reports, they're generally cheaper, they're generally more focused towards the employee, because they're able to tell them about the care that that person has received and how they develop within it. Occupational health providers, because they're a private service and they run just simply on that basis, A, they're quicker, B, they're normally more commercially focused, they're just a lot more expensive. So that would be how I would manage that. But that's the inherent problem with it, is that you write to a GP and they just simply don't respond to you, or they come back 8 weeks later and they say, we can't comment. We're not occupational health providers, so we don't know. And that's even more frustrating, because you get a bill for 120 quid that comes on the top of that too. And I know my wife's a GP, so I'm constantly berating her about her profession, actually about mine. So yeah, so I would say if we're writing to a GP, we're telling our employee that if we don't get a response back within a set period of time, then we're going to do something else. You know, we're going to look in another way. So at the very least, we've got it open, and we're saying we ask that GP to respond within a set period, and if they don't respond, then we cancel that instruction. We send through to an occupational provider instead, or we create a link with an occupational provider directly and then funneled through to a specific account manager there. I've had some good success with that, because if you say to that person, you know, we're going to be using you for all these, we want a direct channel, that can be really helpful and just speed up that process a bit more.
Brilliant, thank you. That's really interesting. We have a situation that an attendee's put here, and this person said, a new member of staff who a few weeks ago mentioned that earlier in the year she was very ill with COVID. She ended up in hospital and on a ventilation machine. She's just taken up a full-time job and has been in post for 1 month. She did mention that she gets tired on occasions. Should I treat this member of staff with a potential long COVID and start managing her in a way that we might have to make reasonable adjustments for her to continue work?
Yeah, I would do that. Yeah, and we're now on reasonable notice that might be long COVID. Obviously, clearly very poorly. She went onto a ventilator. It's worthwhile trying to manage that with her now. But I mean, because there's two aspects to that. There is the safety and security that she'll feel with us managing her, knowing that we do care about her and we're not just going to let her fail. You know, you feel tired, you can't do your job role, we're going to get you out. It's much better to be upfront with her. And the other side of that coin is we've started to manage it nice and early. So if it does become a problem, we're able then to escalate that through to ill health capability process nice and swiftly. And she knows what's required of her. She knows we're going to support. So yeah, I mean, I'm always a massive fan of getting these started as quickly as possible. It just means that we don't have to wait later on. And also that individual can never come back to us and say, well, this is all out of the blue, or what was the trigger point? Because we know she said, I was ill. We said, great, right, here's how we're going to manage you. This is our plan for you. And just having that all documented out and written down, everyone signs it, it just gives everyone that security as well. She might come back and just say, no, I'm absolutely fine. But at the very least, we've done what we can and we've got that documented too.
Brilliant, thank you. That's great. Another question here saying, how would you deal with issues around members of staff who are unvaccinated and other members of staff who have COVID and are very cautious about working with unvaccinated members of staff?
Yeah, so that's tricky as a question because there's tons to that.
Yeah.
But I guess give you my kind of brief overview. Vaccination in itself is only one method of preventing people from having COVID. There is no requirement on you to be vaccinated unless you work in a designated industry. There's also no obligation on the employer to know who's vaccinated and who is not, unless we have a reason for that. Holding sensitive medical data about whether or not someone is or is not vaccinated doesn't automatically arise out of their employment. So we're going to need their consent to hold that data. If staff members have shared that individually and said, well, I've got COVID, or people who are unvaccinated say, I don't want to work with someone who has got COVID or has got COVID recently, we're going to have to work out whether or not we can put safety and security measures into our workplace to keep those people apart, whether or not we can just maintain social distancing and other aspects of PPE, normally masks or visors, whether or not we can make people work from home or flexibly work for a set period and adapt shifts to adapt to that. If, as always happens, I make all those suggestions and then a business comes back to me and they say, we can't do any of those. These people have to work together. They have to be in the same space. Then eventually what you're going to be doing is normally it's just going to be PPE and so social distancing. It gets down to a point where if those two people can't work together, or an unvaccinated person doesn't feel safe coming into the workspace because they're working with a person who had COVID or did have COVID, then something's got to give eventually. But all we've got to do is go through that big full process, make sure we've done all those things or considered all those things, and eventually might come down to having to terminate somebody. That's really, really the very, very last resort, and that would be a very unique scenario. I've had tons of questions recently about vaccination status. There are a lot of businesses that are holding that, in my view, unlawfully, just simply because they're holding a piece of medical data about someone that they have no right to, and keeping those records without consent and not updating them or making sure they're accurate, or not using them either, just having them for no good reason. It's in breach of GDPR, and there is going to be a time when the ISU are going to investigate those times, or someone's just going to report you. So looking at that aspect of it, I'm going to park that, because that's a different different seminar in and of itself, and I could bang on about that all day. But yeah, so I think you can put all those systems in place. Eventually something might happen, but you take legal advice at that point, because that's a real hornet's nest.
Brilliant, fantastic. Answer that really well. Definitely a rabbit hole you could go down. We've got another question here from Claire. Should company sick pay be administered by absence due to long COVID as per any other sickness absence?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, you can adapt absence management processes. We're seeing this quite a bit. So say someone who's now got COVID and is required to isolate for 10 days, that can fall outside company sick pay policy. So our businesses are just seeing that massive impact that's come from it. And so they're saying, well, if you've got normal absence for something else, we'll pay you full pay. If you've got COVID related absences, because it is a mandatory period of 10 days, we're going to make that into SSP or a part of it to be unpaid. So you can have those differences to it. I think it will probably be likely to be a reasonable adjustment to, if you've got company sick pay, to attract that to people who've got long COVID. Probably in that scenario, I would treat long COVID as the same as any other absence to make sure you weren't falling foul of disability discrimination, unless you had adapted your process prior to that person going off. They've been notified and agreed to that change as well. I think where some businesses have suffered real financial impact from the pandemic, they've made those changes and they're quite reasonable, but they've consulted with staff about it. So we've written to staff and we said, these are the reasons for it. If we continue to pay everyone whilst you're off sick, full pay for these 10-day periods, we're going to go under, we're going to make some redundancies. We don't want to do that. Here's the proposals to prevent that from happening, gathered views, consulted, and come to a proper outcome. If you just, when someone goes off with long COVID, just don't pay them, that's disability discrimination, likely. Legally, you'll just tick them off. And then you've got grievances that come on the back of it. And then there's other arguments and other litigation. Doing it prior is fine. Doing it afterwards, not fine. It's summary.
Great, fantastic. That was well answered. I've got a message here from Kelsey. Is there anywhere to see an example of HR policy regarding long COVID?
I don't know if there's one available online. We draft them, Freeths draft them. So if you want a quote for that, just drop me an email.
Brilliant. And we've got Toby's email up on the screen still, so do feel free to get in touch with Toby about that. We've got a few that are down the rabbit hole of vaccinations and stuff, so I'll just try to keep them focused on COVID absences. How would you deal with staff who seem to have COVID symptoms but have never had a COVID diagnosis, but think they may have had symptoms in the earlier days?
Ooh, that's interesting. Yeah, so we potentially on reasonable notice that they've got long COVID, I would manage them initially. So if we think that they might, then there's a potential that they do. It'd be very similar to someone who we thought suffered with anxiety maybe, or suffered with some aspect of poor mental health, where they were exhibiting signs like being more stressed or reacting to things in an unusual way, becoming more aggressive or more confrontational on things. That's the same aspect for me, I would think, that it would come along with long COVID, because I think if we think that that person might have an ongoing issue, it's appropriate for us to seek to manage it. That person might just not know, you know, but if we can get them either to go to a GP, see a GP and describe the symptoms to them, it might be that we come down to it and say, well, you've got these symptoms, there might be something underlying, go and get some tests for that. But yeah, we should treat that with real caution, because that aspect of it might be this is us knowing that, you know, it's reasonable for us to assume that they've got long COVID and therefore might have a disability. And so that would be my view on it. So yeah, I think you would try to manage that in the same way, try to get out in front of it as early as you can. And it might just come down to it, the fact that they've got either something else underlying or it's just not long COVID, and then we can discount that. But equally, we've then spoken to that person and they feel managed, you know, they feel as if it's been more appropriate. So we're seeing this lack of concentration, we're seeing fatigue, you know, we don't think you're quite well, we want to make sure you're okay. And that's just beneficial. It's good employee relations.
Yeah, fantastic. Another question here. Would you suggest not including long COVID related absence in the count of days for trigger points?
Yeah, so you can exclude, for absence management, you can exclude certain types of absence. You can exclude disability or pregnancy related absences as well. Yeah, if you think that person's got a disability, then I would definitely exclude that from a certain trigger point. But I think there's two parts to that question really, because excluding those absences means that we don't stage them up in warnings. So we say, well, actually you breached this. We would normally be taking you through a process whereby we manage your absence, but we're not going to do that because we're going to exclude some of those absences in the Bradford factor or one of the other factors that's available. My view really would be, if they hit the trigger, we still manage them. So we still manage them anyway, but when we talk to them about it, we say, we're not considering these absences in this process, but we are considering the other absences you might have got that might have contributed towards it. We want to help you, we want to manage your welfare. And you know, and it'd be beneficial for us to still take that step with them. But yet, I get it, if we're then saying to them, criticizing them or doing something that's discrimination arising from a disability, or staging them up in potential warnings, or giving them an improvement note, it would be worthwhile in excluding those absences for taking that step. But that wouldn't mean that we wouldn't still manage that person or let them know that we're wanting to help them to a set degree.
Brilliant, thank you. We'll just answer two more questions because we're slightly running out of time. This first question is from Dan. How can you engage an employee with long COVID to communicate with them, with the business, to help them return to work, i.e. refusing to see OH due to symptoms, etc.?
Okay, yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, so you can contact anyone while they're on sick. You know, there's no barrier to that. The only times you wouldn't be able to do that is if a GP or some other medical professional had said to you, you can't contact this person because it's going to impact on their health, and they'd have to work out some other way of dealing with it. Those are few and far between. That person won't go and see an occupational health provider. You can get assessments done by video. If they simply won't engage, they will not go and see an occupational health provider, or they make a lot of excuses to not take that step for whatever reason. we can go through the process without the benefit of medical advice. So the position is that an employer has the obligation and the duty to take a decision about an employee and their employment. That is best done with information, either from the employee directly or from another provider. In the instance where we take reasonable steps to seek that information, if we cannot get it, we're not required to simply do nothing. We can then take our decision without that step. What I generally suggest is that we do a preliminary outcome. So we say, you're not seeking advice as we've asked you to, you're not seeming to want to go and see occupational health or your GP. We think you've got these symptoms. We need you in your job role because of X, Y, Z. Your job still needs to be done. Other people are managing it for you. Impact your absence, we're still paying you whilst you're off. So we can't have that continue on indefinitely. Our preliminary outcome, without the benefit of advice or without the benefit of speaking to you, is this: that we're going to recommend the termination of your employment. We don't want to do that. What we want to do is get this medical picture, to speak to you about it, and then it sort of builds it in. So you're giving them the potential worst case scenario, letting them know what your thoughts are before you actually take that decision. And it just means that we've done what we can, asking, eventually saying, we'll take the decision without it if we have to. We just don't want to have to take that step. So it's, you can adapt the process to kind of conclude that. You do get that sometimes. You do get people who just don't want to engage.
Brilliant, fantastic. And our final question of the day is from Stephen, asking, can you ask about COVID and or COVID related absences at a recruitment stage?
It'd be the same for any other type of absence. So the Equality Act allows you to make requests about someone's health only insofar as they relate to their employment. So if you're going to get that information and use it to not recruit somebody because of a potential disability related absence, then you're going to fall foul of disability discrimination. So you can ask health questions. It's just they have to be related to the employment itself. So if you're going to ask those questions, you want to make sure strictly that you understand the requirements of the Equality Act and that you're only asking questions that can be reasonably justified. A lot of employers at recruitment stage do ask questions about absence. They ask past employers about absence profiles as well. All those things are potentially in breach. But you can do it, but as long as it's a genuine occupational requirement.
Brilliant, thank you. That was great. Great questions from everyone as well. There are a few unanswers that we won't have time to answer today, but if you do have any specific questions for Toby, like you mentioned, please do feel free to get in contact with him. So please do join me in thanking Toby for his expertise in hearing about long-term absences and long COVID within the workplace. And also thank you so much for your questions. And just a reminder as well today, if you are interested in managing your employee absence, we do have our 3-month free trial. So you will get your free 3 months to be rewarded for when you are with Mitra Toolkit for a 12-month period. So please do put free for free at our landing page that our team member has just put in the chat if you are looking to sign up to an employee and holiday and absence management system such as ourselves. We'll be sending everyone a follow-up email, including the full recording of today's session. So if there is any insight you want to gather from that, we will be sending that out in the email prior. Fantastic. Thank you again, Toby, for today's webinar. I hope everyone enjoyed it, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks again. Thanks.